Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll now begin with Story 1, Women Brewers and the Backbone of Medieval Taverns. You find yourself stepping into a modest, timber-framed building nestled along the edge of a muddy village green. The roof sags ever so slightly under the weight of age, and the scent that greets you is not unpleasant, yeasty, herbal, and warm. You're in the heart of the 14th century, and this building is more than just a home. It is the workplace of an alewife, one of thousands of women across medieval Europe who brewed and sold ale from their hearth. A woman's craft in a man's world. Before brewing became an industrial operation controlled by men's guilds, it was a domestic task as common and necessary as baking bread or fetching water. Brewing ale was women's work, passed down from mother to daughter, perfected over lifetimes of quiet repetition. Ale was not merely a beverage. In towns and rural villages alike, it was a staple of daily life, safer to drink than often contaminated water and rich in nutrients. It was consumed by adults and children alike, from the crack of dawn to the final moments before sleep. This made the role of the alewife not just convenient, it made her indispensable. Most alewives operated from their homes. Their brewing vessels, typically made of wood, copper, or clay, were crude by modern standards. Malted barley or oats, water, and herbs like gruit or yarrow, before the widespread use of hops, were boiled together in large pots over open fires. Fermentation took place in wooden tubs set in corners of kitchens or small sheds. The process was simple, and so were the results: a murky, flat but nourishing drink that fermented quickly and needed to be consumed just as fast. Unlike today's breweries, these operations were ephemeral. An alewife might brew once or twice a week, hanging a broom or branch outside her door, a common signifier that fresh ale was available. Ale in the household economy. For many women, brewing was more than a duty. It was a business. In an age when few economic opportunities were open to women, especially the poor, brewing offered a rare window into financial independence, albeit a precarious one. A successful brew meant surplus ale could be sold to neighbors or travelers, and while profits were small, they could sustain a household during hard times. Sometimes, a woman might gain enough renown to become the go-to brewer for her village, but fame brought scrutiny. Local officials, often male, monitored brewing closely, not out of concern for quality, but for tax and price control. The assize of ale, a law originating in the 13th century in England, gave manorial courts the power to enforce ale quality and pricing. Ale tasters, appointed by lords or local councils, were tasked with sampling brews, issuing fines for weak ale, and punishing false measures. And so the alewife walked a narrow path. She had to brew well, sell fairly, and avoid the scorn of both neighbors and officials. Success meant financial autonomy. Failure or even perceived overstep meant public shamming or worse. Dangers of reputation. The alewife, like the midwife, walked a fine line in medieval society. Women who gained too much economic independence were often viewed with suspicion. The image of the alewife, hunched, loud, conniving, became a stock character in popular songs, moralistic literature, and even church sermons. She was accused of watering down ale, using false weights, or luring customers into sinful behavior. Some medieval illustrations depicted alewives dragged into hell by demons, their offenses being overcharging or selling during church hours. Though many of these accusations were exaggerated or symbolic, they reflected the social tensions around female autonomy and public presence. Even the word brewster, once a gendered term for a female brewer, eventually fell out of favor as brewing transitioned into male hands and professional guilds formed in urban centers. The brewer became a man's title, and ale-making was increasingly removed from the hearth and placed in the realm of commerce and regulation. The physical work of brewing. It's important not to romanticize the alewife's craft. Brewing was physically demanding. The sheer volume of water needed, often carried bucket by bucket from wells or streams, was immense. Wood had to be chopped for fires, grains ground or purchased, herbs gathered or bought at market. Fermentation was a fickle process. Temperatures, seasons, and ingredients varied wildly. Without thermometers, hydrometers, or even written recipes, alewives relied on memory, instinct, and taste. A misstep could lead to an undrinkable brew, and with that, a week's income lost. Still, in villages and towns across England, France, Germany, and beyond, women brewed. Some did so for decades. Their labor-fed households sustained communities and, without fanfare, laid the foundations for Europe's brewing traditions. Unwritten recipes and herbal secrets. Interestingly, many alewives became local experts not only in brewing, but in herbs and their uses. Before hops became the dominant preservative and flavoring agent, gruit, a mixture of bitter herbs, was used to season ale. The exact blend varied regionally, and its preparation was often closely guarded. Yarrow, mugwort, horehound, sweet gale, these were common in brews. Some provided medicinal qualities, others intoxicating effects. Alewives who mastered these herbal mixes became quietly respected and sometimes feared figures in their communities. This herbal knowledge, passed down orally, tied the alewife to both nourishment and healing. In times of illness or childbirth, she might be called upon not just for ale, but for tonics and teas. This blending of roles, brewer, healer, herbalist, made her central to community life. Yet this same knowledge sometimes led to accusations of witchcraft, especially as suspicion of women's power grew in later centuries. A hearth now cold. By the late medieval period, as towns grew and brewing became more commercialized, male-run breweries began to dominate. Urban guilds often excluded women, and brewing laws became more rigid. Slowly, the alewife's role diminished not because she was less needed, but because society was less willing to accept her authority. Today, only fragments of these women's lives remain. A few court records, a handful of fines paid for weak ale or unlicensed brewing, some rude songs and tales. But their contributions were immense not just in what they brewed, but in how they shaped the very fabric of daily life for medieval Europe. So as we sit beside the imagined hearth of an alewife, the fire casting low shadows across rough wooden walls, one wonders, what would have happened if these women had not brewed at all? What stories of survival, economy, or culture would have vanished with the steam rising from those early morning pots? You return once more to the flickering hearth, the fire now lower, the scent of hops and herbs fainter. Outside, the village settles into dusk, but inside, the labor of the alewife is far from over. A fresh brew cools beside the fire, and the next test looms: inspection, taxation, and the ever-present risk of censure. Brewing, after all, was not simply domestic work, it was political, economic, and profoundly gendered. The ale conners and the assize. To understand the pressures placed upon medieval alewives, one must consider the role of the ale conner, an official responsible for ensuring that ale sold within a community met specific standards. In England especially, the ale conner was empowered by the assize of bread and ale, first established in 1266, to sample and approve batches of brew before it could be sold to the public. This was not a casual taste test. A conner might test the strength of the ale by pouring some onto a wooden bench, then sitting in it while wearing leather trousers. If the leather stuck a result of unfermented sugars, the ale was deemed too weak or too sweet. Penalties could follow. These tests, however absurd they may seem today, held serious consequences. If an alewife was found in violation, she could face public scolding, fines, or even the pillory. Her name would be recorded, her reputation publicly damaged. Repeat offenses could mean exclusion from selling altogether. The ale conner, usually male and often drawn from the merchant or landowning class, held considerable power over women like her. His approval or disapproval shaped income, status, and community trust. While some ale conners were fair, others were corrupt or biased, accepting bribes or harboring personal vendettas. Thus, the act of brewing, though performed in private, had very public consequences. The alehouse as a legal space. Alehouses were not simply places for drink and merriment. They were, for all intents and purposes, social hubs and frequently fell under legal scrutiny. In England, local manorial courts or borough courts often included on their rolls the names of alewives who were fined for selling outside of permitted hours, using false measures, or failing inspections. Take the village of Brigstock in Northamptonshire. Court rolls from the late 14th century list women by name Marjorie, Alice, Isolde, each cited for brewing ale against the assize. Some were fined a few pence, others warned or banned temporarily. These fines could be frequent, recurring almost monthly. In some villages, nearly every alewife would be fined at least once a year, suggesting that the regulations were less about ensuring quality and more about exerting control and collecting revenue. The punishments were not always financial. In some cases, repeat offenders were sentenced to the pillory, placed in the stocks, or even paraded through town in public humiliation. The community gathered, watched, and remembered. It was a potent reminder. A woman may brew, but only under watchful eyes. Religious scrutiny and the moral gaze. As Christianity shaped the moral framework of Europe, alehouses, and by extension, alewives came under ecclesiastical scrutiny. Preachers railed against the tavern as a den of sin, a place of idle gossip, lewd songs, gluttony, and even sexual temptation. The alewife who facilitated such behavior by supplying drink was often cast as morally dubious. In many morality plays and sermons from the 13th to 15th centuries, the alewife becomes a caricature, dishonest, greedy, loud, and lustful. The Towneley Mysteries, a collection of Middle English religious plays, includes scenes where alewives are mocked for cheating customers, watering ale, or consorting with demons. These were not harmless jokes. They reflected real social anxieties, especially about women, who operated independently outside the direct control of husbands, guilds, or church authorities. It was not uncommon for women to run alehouses alone, either as widows or as unmarried individuals. In doing so, they occupied a space between respectability and rebellion. For every neighbor who praised the alewife's generosity, another might whisper of her pride or sorcery. And so the moral gaze joined the legal one, both converging on the simmering pot at the hearth. From alewife to witch. As the centuries progressed, some of the stereotypes that surrounded alewives' herbal knowledge, independence, secrecy began to overlap with traits associated with witchcraft. The broom, once a sign that ale was for sale, was repurposed in popular imagination as a witch's tool. The bubbling pot, the strange herbs, the cat underfoot, these everyday realities of brewing were later reinterpreted as signs of magical intent. This shift was not immediate, nor was every alewife accused of sorcery. But in the early modern period, as witch trials surged across Europe, a number of women with brewing knowledge found themselves ensnared by fear and superstition. The irony is hard to miss. What once was a sign of skill, the ability to ferment, to preserve, to blend herbs, became a cause for persecution. Yet for much of the medieval period, the alewife was not yet labeled a witch. She remained instead in a gray space, vital to community life, yet constantly scrutinized, always a step away from censure. Urban competition and the rise of the brewers' guilds. In towns and cities, especially by the 14th century, brewing was beginning to shift. No longer a purely domestic task, it was becoming a commercial enterprise. Men, particularly those with capital, began to open larger operations. These required more space, more equipment, and greater consistency. Urban brewing guilds began to form, often explicitly excluding women. In places like London, Cologne, or Bruges, brewing licenses and membership were reserved for men. While some women still brewed in these settings, they increasingly did so under the name or protection of a male relative. This transformation was not just about gender, it was about scale, regulation, and profit. Beer, made with hops, had a longer shelf life than traditional ale and could be transported and stored. This allowed for greater reach and greater profits. The alewife, whose brewing was ephemeral and local, could not compete. Her batches soured in days. She had no guild to advocate for her, no official apprentices, and no protection from the shifting tide of commerce. By the late 15th century, in many urban centers, the role of the woman brewer had faded into obscurity, replaced by male brewers with larger operations and government-sanctioned protections. Cultural memory and the vanishing alewife. Though the alewife once stood at the very center of medieval daily life, her legacy has been largely obscured. Few records survive beyond legal fines and religious mockery. Her recipes were rarely written down. Her techniques, passed by word of mouth, faded with time. Yet in some villages, her presence lingers in tavern names, in folklore, even in the symbols on old pub signs. The broom, the cauldron, the cat. And in quiet corners of history, her role remains undeniable. For centuries, women provided the essential drink of Europe. They sustained communities through famine, plague, and war. They offered warmth, nourishment, and in many ways, independence. But why, one wonders, was that independence so often met with suspicion? And what does it say about the way we remember history when the very hands that fed and quenched an entire continent are forgotten? The embers in the hearth glow low now, the brew cooled and distributed, the tankards rinsed in rainwater. Somewhere beyond the walls of the alehouse, a town crier finishes his evening round. You, the quiet observer, remain listening, watching, and reflecting on the woman whose labor and livelihood once stirred the heart of medieval daily life. But by the end of the 15th century, the alewife was no longer at the center of the brewing world. The curtain was quietly falling on her chapter in history. This final section traces that decline and considers what echoes of her story remain today. Hops and the long goodbye. The introduction of hops into Western European brewing had far-reaching implications, ones that deeply influenced the fate of the alewife. Ale, the traditional, unhopped beverage brewed by women, was short-lived. It soured within days and had to be consumed locally, making it a truly neighborhood drink. But beer, brewed with hops, which added bitterness and acted as a preservative, could be stored longer, traveled farther, and was better suited to the growing demands of trade. The adoption of hopped beer began in earnest in the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, by the 13th century. In England, resistance was fierce at first. Ale purists, including many alewives, considered hops a foreign contaminant. English laws even banned hopped beer for periods in the 15th century, declaring it unfit for consumption. But economic pressures eventually overruled tradition. By the 16th century, beer had not only gained acceptance but become dominant. The drink of the local alewife was being replaced by the product of large-scale, male-dominated commercial breweries. This change meant more than a shift in taste. It marked the displacement of women from the brewing economy. Hopped beer required larger vats, more storage space, and greater initial capital, all of which favored urban entrepreneurs, many of whom were men. Brewing moved out of kitchens and into workshops. Alewives, once the stewards of everyday drink, found themselves edged out of the trade they had built. The silence of the records. For historians, one of the most telling signs of the alewife's decline is the silence that follows her once ubiquitous name. In 13th and 14th century court rolls, alewives are mentioned frequently fined for selling too strong, too weak, or untaxed ale. By the 16th century, such entries dwindle. It is not that brewing ceased, it's that women's participation in it was no longer officially recognized, nor tolerated in many guild structures. Guilds had rules excluding women from membership, or at best, limiting their participation to widows of male members, and only for a brief transition period. This change systematically erased the alewife as a recognized trade identity. Where once she was a fixture in the village economy, she now became invisible to legal and institutional structures. What remained was the caricature, the greedy crone, the lewd hostess, the bawd. Centuries of serious economic labor had been reduced to a joke, a cautionary figure in plays, broadsides, and tavern lore. Shadows in song and tale. Despite the decline of the alewife as a profession, her cultural image endured, albeit distorted. In literature, especially popular ballads and morality plays, she was portrayed as greedy and corrupt. Songs warned of alewives who watered their brew or cheated patrons. In one famous English ballad from the 16th century, Jack Juggler, an alewife is accused of diluting her ale with water from the horse trough. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the hostess, though not named an alewife, embodies many of the same traits: shrewd, outspoken, and firmly in control of her tavern. Though humorous, such portrayals reinforced social views about women who occupied public economic spaces. Even as her actual presence dwindled, the myth of the alewife persisted, shaped by the fears and fantasies of a changing world. And perhaps, beneath those stories, a trace of her independence and resilience still lingered. A gendered shift in brewing. While the term alewife faded, brewing did not cease to be domestic, at least, not entirely. In rural areas, women continued to brew for household consumption well into the early modern period. However, they increasingly did so without legal recognition or public sale. Brewing became another invisible task, part of the long list of unpaid labor expected of women in pre-industrial households. Meanwhile, men who controlled breweries formed guilds, gained political favor, and expanded into international trade. Beer was shipped in barrels across the North Sea and the Baltic. Brewing became not only industrial but imperial. And the story of the alewife, reduced to a historical footnote if remembered at all. The slow rediscovery. Only in the last few decades have historians begun to piece together the lost legacy of women brewers. Court rolls, household accounts, and ecclesiastical records have been revisited with new questions: who brewed? Who earned? Who was fined? The evidence, scattered and fragile, reveals a world where women once dominated a vital industry, not as exceptions, but as the norm. Scholars have now traced women brewers from England to Scandinavia, from the Low Countries to the Baltic states. Each region had its own customs, but the pattern was similar. Brewing began at the hearth, under the care of women, and ended in the hands of commercial men. This rediscovery has inspired a quiet cultural renaissance. Some modern craft breweries, particularly women-owned ones, have embraced the legacy of the alewife. Labels depict her proudly, no longer as a crooked-nosed villain, but as a brewer, herbalist, and entrepreneur. Her story, though long obscured, is being brewed anew. What she left behind. The alewife did not leave monuments. She did not write books or dictate chronicles. She left no heirs to a brewing dynasty, nor palaces built on profit. But she did leave something subtler and arguably more important. She left behind a tradition, a domestic knowledge base passed through generations, a rhythm of life marked by fermentation cycles, a web of relationships woven through cups of shared ale. She also left behind a lesson that labor, even when unacknowledged, shapes the world. Though her name rarely appears in grand histories, her influence permeated every village, every meal, every gathering around the hearth. Her hands stirred the pots that kept Europe's towns and farms alive. So tonight, as the tavern shutters close and the fire dwindles, consider this. How many more alewives women of skill, endurance, and quiet revolution wait still to be remembered? And if we fail to ask, how many of their stories will remain untold? Story 2. The Road to Canterbury. Pilgrims, Pints, and Pilferers. You awaken to the sound of bells, not church bells, but small iron ones jingling from a cart as it creaks over cobblestone. The early mist of a spring morning clings to the trees, and boots thud against wet soil. You're standing on one of the most traveled roads of medieval England, the route to Canterbury. Though the journey promises holy purpose, it is also a road of laughter, discomfort, danger, and more often than you might expect, ale. This is the world of the medieval pilgrim, and the alehouses and inns that sustain their dusty travels. Pilgrimage as sacred and social journey. In medieval Europe, pilgrimage was one of the few ways common people could leave their villages without attracting suspicion. To walk or occasionally ride to a holy site was an act of devotion, repentance, or thanksgiving. Some sought healing, others forgiveness. Many simply longed to travel and saw pilgrimage as a socially acceptable excuse. Canterbury, where the shrine of St. Thomas Becket drew thousands each year, became one of the most popular destinations for English pilgrims. The pilgrimage was especially encouraged after Becket's canonization in 1173, and even more so after the miracles associated with his tomb spread by word of mouth. But while the destination was sacred, the journey was anything but purely spiritual. The reality of the pilgrim's path. Though literature, like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, paints the road to Canterbury with a palette of storytelling and satire, the physical journey was often grueling. Most pilgrims traveled on foot. A few could afford horses or carts, but muddy roads, unmarked paths, and frequent detours made travel slow and uncertain. Inns and alehouses along the way became crucial for rest and nourishment. These stops weren't just about food or lodging, they were essential parts of the pilgrimage economy. Local economies near well-trodden roads flourished as innkeepers, brewers, cooks, and stable hands catered to weary travelers. Unlike modern tourism, there was no guarantee of comfort. A bed was often just straw in a corner. A meal might be thick pottage, black bread, and a mug of ale, and yet, after 15 miles in the rain, it was a feast. Ale served more than one purpose. It hydrated, yes, safer than most stream water, but it also offered relief from pain, especially when laced with warming spices or herbs like ginger and long pepper. It dulled the aching of joints and softened the blow of another cold night's sleep under a barn's eaves. The Pilgrim's Alehouse. The alehouses along pilgrimage routes were a unique category. Some were no more than a single room in a cottage, where a woman offered her own brew in exchange for coin or barter. Others, especially near popular shrines or towns like Rochester or Southwark, were licensed inns complete with stables, cooking hearths, and common rooms crowded with travelers. In these places, pilgrims found more than ale. They found stories, local gossip, and sometimes warnings. The road was filled with dangers: highwaymen, wild dogs, false guides, and dishonest hosts. A wise pilgrim shared a drink and listened carefully. Not all alehouses were equal, of course. In smaller hamlets, quality varied greatly. Ale could be sour, thin, or adulterated. The assize of ale, mentioned in our previous story, still applied, but enforcement was patchy in the countryside. Yet the alehouse was where one could feel human again after hours of slogging through cold fields. For a few pence, the world grew warmer, your legs lighter, and your companions more bearable. Mixed company on the road. Unlike most social spaces in medieval Europe, pilgrimages mix people of all classes. You might find a plowman, a knight, a nun, and a pardoner all under the same inn roof, each with different reasons for travel and wildly different standards for what counted as a decent ale. This created tensions. Nobles might sneer at the betting or the fair. Clergy might scold the innkeeper for allowing gambling or bawdy songs. But ale had a way of leveling the field. After a few pints, even a friar might admit he preferred the fire to the chapel just for the evening. Women were also present in large numbers. Some were devout pilgrims, others were merchants or camp followers. A few were drawn by the promise of coin from lonely travelers. The line between pious devotion and opportunism blurred easily, especially after dark, with ale in hand. And what better place to hear the news of the world than beside a barrel of ale, surrounded by people from every corner of England? Licensed inns and the role of the church. The church, though supportive of pilgrimage, was wary of the moral hazards it created. To mitigate sin, some inns near shrines were operated by ecclesiastical institutions or monastic orders. These were called xenodokia guest houses intended for pilgrims, the poor, and clergy. These tended to be cleaner, more orderly, and with rules against gambling, drunkenness, or lewdness. They often offered a meal of simple fare, fish on Fridays, lentils or legumes, and diluted ale. But they were few and often overcrowded. The majority of pilgrims sought out more commercial accommodations where drink flowed freer, dice clattered against wood, and the air was thick with tailies. The church may have tutted, but the pilgrims came anyway. Pilgrims and pilferers. Not everyone on the road had holy intent. The pilgrimage route attracted its share of conmen, beggars in disguise, and outright thieves. Pilgrims were, by nature, strangers vulnerable to tricks, high prices, and theft. Some alehouses developed reputations as dens of deceit. A landlord might water the ale or inflate the bill. A hostler might steal from horses. Prostitutes and swindlers followed the routes, often posing as fellow travelers. And yet, the alehouse remained a necessary risk, a place to rest, to warm, to forget. Pilgrims developed strategies, traveling in groups, watching over each other's belongings, appointing someone to guard the packs while others drank. They learned to ask locals about reputable inns, to avoid establishments where too much laughter was heard from the door, a possible sign of gaming or worse. Even so, not all could avoid trouble. Many left with fewer coins than they planned and more stories than they intended. Closing time and open roads. As the candlelight dims in a small roadside and outside Maidstone, pilgrims settle in for the night, their feet blistered, their stomachs full, their minds drifting between prayer and exhaustion. The road to Canterbury, though less than 60 miles from London, might take a week or more depending on pace and weather. Along the way, the alehouse became not only a physical respite, but a symbol of the journey itself, messy, communal, full of hardship and unexpected joy. Here, over a crude wooden table and shared jug of ale, strangers became companions. Jokes were traded, wounds were bandaged, songs were sung poorly and loudly. In the distance, a shrine beckoned, but tonight, the road ended at the alehouse. And tomorrow? Will the weather hold? Will the coins last? Will the relic at Canterbury grant the healing they hope for? Or is the true pilgrimage already unfolding, pint by pint, story by story, along the road itself? The inn is colder this morning. Damp clothes hang over wooden beams, steaming gently above the hearth. Outside, carts groan as they creak forward, and pilgrims stretch stiff limbs before returning to the mud-soaked path. The destination still lies ahead, but the experiences of the alehouse, warm ale, warmer gossip, and the ever-turning wheel of human company linger like the smell of smoke on your cloak. This section delves deeper into the culture, rituals, and social tensions that brewed alongside the ale in these medieval way stations. Alehouses as story exchanges. In a world without mass communication, the alehouse was a node in a living network of oral history. On pilgrimage routes, they became hubs for news, rumor, and tall tales. One traveler might bring word of uprisings in the north, another of floods that closed roads in Kent. In a time when literacy was low and official news scarce, these exchanges were essential. And of course, stories grew in the telling. The longer the night and the deeper the mug, the more dramatic the tale. Pilgrims were natural storytellers. Many had little else to offer but the content of their memory, tales of saints, sins, storms survived, miracles witnessed, crimes narrowly escaped. The alehouse amplified this function, with drink-loosening tongues and listeners hungry for distraction. Chaucer may have fictionalized these exchanges in his Canterbury Tales, but the idea was rooted in reality. Storytelling was a cultural pastime, and alehouses made ideal theaters. They were intimate, smoky, and charged with the strange energy of people who would never meet again after their journey's end. The alehouse as confessional, unofficial. Interestingly, some pilgrims treated the alehouse as a kind of confessional, albeit a very secular one. Though formal confession remained the domain of priests, the privacy of the open road and the camaraderie of strangers allowed for a different kind of emotional release. Over a shared pot of ale, travelers might admit sins they were too ashamed to voice at home, broken vows, infidelities, debts unpaid. The journey offered a kind of anonymity. For a few miles and a few nights, you could become someone else or, perhaps, your truest self. There was even a term for this: road honesty, the unfiltered truths people spoke when far from home and accountable to no one. Alehouses, in this sense, became places of personal reckoning, not formal, not sacred, but deeply human. And for some, the journey's spiritual benefit began not at the shrine, but here, with raw honesty over crude benches and flickering rushlights. Pilgrim tokens and the souvenir economy. As pilgrimage evolved, it gave rise to a thriving economy of tokens, trinkets, and relics, many of which were traded or sold in alehouses and inns. Pilgrims often wore badges or brooches displaying the symbol of their destination: the scallop shell for Santiago, the Canterbury bell for St. Thomas Becket, or the crossed keys for Rome. These tokens served as proof of intent and, later, proof of completion. They also helped travelers identify each other along the road. Alehouses often served as informal marketplaces, where tokens were bought, sold, or bartered. Some were real. Others were fakes mass-produced in tin or lead, sold to gullible travelers by clever opportunists. The same in that offered warm stew might also offer a supposedly genuine bone fragment of a saint for a fee. This trade blurred the lines between faith and commerce. The church often condemned the sale of dubious relics, but enforcement was difficult. People believed what they wished to believe, especially after days of hardship. A token offered comfort and a story to take home. Vice and virtue on the road. While pilgrimage was promoted as an act of virtue, the behavior of pilgrims did not always align with ecclesiastical ideals. Many alehouses were dens of gambling, prostitution, and deceit, especially in towns that grew rich from constant pilgrim traffic. Authorities issued frequent warnings. Church councils forbade clerics from drinking in alehouses or lodging in mixed-gender rooms. Monastic orders tried to run alternative lodging houses with stricter rules, but enforcement was limited by geography and human nature. In places like Southwark, just outside London, the first steps of the Canterbury pilgrimage were often accompanied by tavern crawling, music, and revelry. Local authorities were well aware. Licensing records show that Southwark had more inns per capita than almost anywhere else in medieval England. It was understood, not always condoned, but accepted that pilgrims would indulge before setting off. Some saw it as a final pleasure before austerity. Others never truly planned to reach the shrine at all. Disputes, fights, and the Pilgrim Code. With ale comes conflict. Pilgrims were not always peaceful companions. Conflicts over space, payment, insult, or injury were common. Alehouses sometimes employed bouncers or relied on local men to keep order, especially near shrines where tempers ran high. Records exist of fights breaking out in inns over stolen goods, insults to family honor, or unpaid tabs. One 14th century account describes a skirmish in an alehouse outside Rochester, where a pilgrim accused another of sleeping with his wife in the barn behind the inn. The argument escalated to fists and then blades. These events prompted some pilgrimage groups to develop unofficial codes of conduct. Traveling companions would elect a leader, agree on rules, and assign watch duty in inns. This self-governance reduced theft and infighting, but not always successfully. Still, for many, the alehouse remained a safe enough space as long as one stayed alert, traveled in company, and avoided dice games played by men with well-worn knives. Inns as microcosms of society. Perhaps what made the alehouse so central to the pilgrimage experience was its social fluidity. In few other places could a peasant drink beside a noble, or a tinker share a bench with a monk. Status still mattered and money still spoke loudly, but the walls of the alehouse blurred hierarchies. Hunger, exhaustion, and drink made equals of many. In this way, the pilgrimage alehouse reflected the contradictions of medieval life. Faith mingled with vice. Wealth rubbed against poverty. The sacred met the profane not in opposition, but in daily entanglement. And in that mingling, a form of community emerged. Imperfect, brief, but unforgettable. The road continues. Night falls again. The alehouse glows with activity, some pilgrims drowsy by the hearth, others deep in arguments about relics, miracles, and the best path through the next forest. Outside, the wind howls faintly, reminding all that tomorrow brings more mud, more uncertainty, and more aching feet. But for now, the cups are filled. The stew bubbles quietly, and someone begins to sing an old hymn off-key but earnest. It's a scene repeated countless times in medieval Europe. In this space, the pilgrimage is not a line from point A to B, but a weaving of stories, prayers, regrets, and hope. A slow transformation shaped not just by shrines and saints, but by the places between, especially those that served ale. But what did pilgrims actually find when they reached their sacred destination? And once the final prayer was said, the token secured, and the shrine admired, what then? The city walls of Canterbury come into view like the rise of a distant hill after miles of flat, muddy track. Pilgrims straighten their backs, adjust the straps on their sacks, and pick up their pace. Some walk in silence, overcome by emotion. Others murmur prayers, while a few simply sigh with relief. They have arrived. But this final section isn't just about reaching the shrine of Thomas Becket, it's about what comes after. What the journey meant, what was gained, and how the alehouses and inns that marked their path lived on in memory. At the gates of Canterbury. Canterbury in the late Middle Ages was a city built around pilgrimage. After the martyrdom of Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170 and his canonization in 1173, the city transformed into a spiritual destination of continental fame. Inns, guest houses, chapels, shops, and guild halls all catered to the thousands who arrived each year. Some pilgrims lodged in monastic hostels operated by Christ Church Priory. These were reserved for the most devout or well-connected. The rest found accommodations in inns often crowded, always expensive. And as in every other part of the road, ale flowed. Canterbury had dozens of alehouses, some centuries old by that point. Pilgrims arriving at the end of their long journey often sought drink first, worship second. It wasn't necessarily irreverence more often, it was simply fatigue. After all, for most, It had been weeks of walking, sore feet, cold meals, and uncertain shelter. The first warm ale in a real cup, not a communal wooden one, enjoyed in a sturdy inn with solid walls, may have felt like a blessing in itself. The shrine and its strange power. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket was not modest. Draped in gold and encrusted with jewels, it stood within Trinity Chapel in Canterbury Cathedral, a beacon of medieval opulence and religious devotion. Pilgrims entered in small groups. Some knelt, others touched relics or left coins and offerings. Miracles were said to occur. Cripples walked, the blind saw, fevers vanished. Whether these were acts of divine intercession, coincidence, or placebo, the stories multiplied and spread across Europe. Many pilgrims carried away ampulely small lead flasks filled with water or oil from the shrine, blessed and sold as tokens of divine favor. But not all pilgrims were so moved. Some were underwhelmed. A few grumbled at the commercialism, the loud vendors selling tokens, the pressure to give coin. One chronicler even described a nobleman quietly turning away from the shrine, muttering that he'd hoped for more humility and less gold. Still, most left changed, even if only by the journey. The alehouse after the shrine. For many pilgrims, the return journey was sobering in every sense. The shrine might have brought peace or fulfillment, but the path back home was long and without the urgency of a destination. Some travelers took different routes, hopping to visit other shrines on the way. Others returned along familiar paths, stopping again at the same alehouses now known, now remembered. A warm welcome might await. An innkeeper might say, "Back again. Did Becket heal you?" These return visits gave alehouses a second role, memory keepers. Pilgrims would recount what they saw at the shrine. News of miracles or frauds would be shared. Their stories added to the growing oral archive of the road. Some pilgrims returned home with deep personal transformation. Others returned simply tired, a little poorer, but content that they had done what they were supposed to do. Alehouse lore and the pilgrim legacy. The influence of pilgrimage on alehouse culture lingered for generations. Many inns changed their names to honor Becket or other saints, the Pilgrim's Rest, the Becket Arms, the Bell and Shrine. Some retained mementos, carvings, icons, fragments of old pilgrim tokens nailed to walls. Tales of famous pilgrims were retold over mugs of ale for decades. Some inns became semi-permanent gathering places for people headed to shrines, building a tradition of hospitality specific to the route. Even in regions that had no direct connection to pilgrimage, the legend of the pilgrim noble, suffering, devoted became a popular trope. Ballads and tales played in alehouses celebrated the figure of the devout traveler, often enhanced with dramatic embellishments. In this way, the pilgrimage didn't just shape the spiritual map of medieval Europe, it reshaped the social role of the alehouse. It became a place where the sacred and profane touched, where stories lived, and where communal memory fermented like the ale itself. Pilgrims returned to ordinary life. Returning pilgrims often faced adjustment. Some had pledged oaths of reform to give up drink or gossip or vice, but quickly found themselves slipping back into old habits. Others carried physical mementos, scallop shells, staffs, or tokens sewn into hats. These marked them, at least for a time, as people who had journeyed far and sought something greater. Not all found what they were looking for. Some returned sick. A few never returned at all, buried by the road or lost to disease. But for most, the journey became a personal mythology. Their children would hear stories of the cold nights, the strange food, the funny Frenchman with the donkey, or the kind innkeeper in Rochester who gave them free bread and ale. And so the experience was passed on not just through relics or written records, but through tales told by the hearth, in the very same alehouses where the journey began. The end of the pilgrimage era. By the mid-16th century, pilgrimage in England began to fade under the weight of the Reformation. In 1538, Henry VIII ordered the destruction of Becket's shrine. The gold was seized, the relics scattered, the pilgrimage outlawed. The great roads to Canterbury fell silent. Alehouses once filled with travelers saw their traffic dwindle. Some shut their doors. Others adapted, catering to merchants or drovers instead. The golden age of the Pilgrim's Inn was over. Yet the memory persisted in pub signs, in local legends, in the architecture of old towns. A few alehouses remained open under the same names, their stories echoing faintly through low-beamed ceilings and soot-darkened hearths. The alehouse as pilgrimage. In a way, every journey to an alehouse, especially in the long tradition of English drinking culture, carries a trace of pilgrimage. The walk, the anticipation, the gathering of companions, the warmth upon arrival, the reflection, the return. It is not sacred in the ecclesiastical sense, but in the human sense, a ritual of movement, story, and connection. For centuries, the roads to shrines were not just physical paths, but spiritual and social ones, and at every bend in the road, there was a house with a hearth, a cup of ale, and a stranger who might soon become a friend. So when next you pass through a quiet English village and see a weathered sign swinging above a narrow doorway, the Pilgrim's Rest, perhaps, or the Crown and Becket, consider what feet once passed this way. Consider what stories were born between pints. And ask, what have we truly lost when we forget the roads people once walked and the places where they paused, poured, and remembered? Story 3. Innkeeper's Justice, How Alehouses Govern Themselves. The door creaks open. Smoke curls from a low hearth. The air smells of barley, old wood, and sweat. Laughter rises from the back of the room, followed by the sharp clatter of dice on a table and a louder-than-necessary protest from a sore loser. The alehouse is alive tonight, but it's not lawless. Look again beneath the noise and drink, and you'll find something unexpected. Rules, roles, and a form of justice quietly at work. This is not a court, yet judgments are made. This is not a council, but order is maintained. This is the alehouse, a cornerstone of medieval society, and though it may seem chaotic, it ran on a surprisingly firm foundation of internal governance. The myth of the lawless tavern. Popular imagination, both medieval and modern, often paints the alehouse as a place of vice and chaos. To be fair, some of that was true. Fights broke out. Debts were ducked. Drunkenness led to regrettable decisions. But disorder, if unchecked, is bad for business. Innkeepers, especially those with established alehouses or inns in towns, had strong incentives to maintain control. A rowdy, dangerous establishment discouraged patrons. Worse, it attracted scrutiny from local authorities. Too many complaints could mean fines, the loss of a brewing license, or even a formal closure. So innkeepers developed their own systems, informal yet effective, rooted in tradition, necessity, and community expectations. The role of the innkeeper, more than a host. The innkeeper in medieval Europe was not simply a seller of drink and food. He, or she, and women did run inns, was judge, mediator, host, peacekeeper, and sometimes enforcer. At the front of every functioning alehouse was someone who controlled access, monitored behavior, and intervened when necessary. An experienced innkeeper recognized drunkards before they grew belligerent, diffused disputes before they turned violent, and understood the subtle politics of which regulars could be seated together and which could not. In many towns, innkeepers were legally responsible for what happened under their roofs. If a fight broke out and weapons were drawn, they were expected to report it. If someone was found dead in the morning, they faced questioning. Records show that innkeepers were frequently summoned to testify in local courts, not only for violent incidents, but also for debts, thefts, and accusations of moral conduct. Their inns served as witnesses, and their testimony often swayed cases. In return, they gained status. A well-regarded innkeeper was a figure of local respect, consulted not only on ale, but on gossip, politics, and even minor disputes among townsfolk. House rules and social boundaries. Alehouses often operated on unwritten rules, many of which were widely understood by patrons. These might include no weapons drawn indoors. While men might carry knives or short swords, it was a serious breach of etiquette to brandish them in a tavern. No gambling on credit. Dice games and cards were common, but bets had to be made with visible coin. Promises were discouraged. No slandering locals. Outsiders criticizing a town or its people often found themselves removed forcefully if needed. Drink in turn. Pushing ahead of others for ale or attempting to pay extra for faster service was frowned upon. Respect the host's word. The innkeeper's authority was final. To challenge it was to risk being banned or worse, blacklisted from other inns. Violation of these informal codes didn't always result in immediate punishment, but repeated offenses marked a person. Reputations mattered, especially in smaller communities. A troublemaker might find themselves unwelcome not just in one alehouse, but across several towns. Local enforcement, the alehouse as a civic arm. Despite their private ownership, alehouses often acted as extensions of local governance. In England, for example, constables and tithing men, local officials charged with maintaining order, frequently used alehouses as points of observation. They listened for rumors of crime, watched for vagrants or suspected thieves, and occasionally called upon the innkeeper to detain a disorderly patron overnight. Inns might even host informal hearings, especially in rural areas where manorial courts met infrequently. A small dispute over grazing rights, debts, or property might be mediated over ale, with local elders and the innkeeper offering judgment. There are even examples of town bylaws that required alehouses to post curfews, limit serving hours, or refuse service to known criminals or vagabonds. The enforcement of these laws was inconsistent, but their existence shows how seriously the alehouse's role in public life was regarded. The tavern as a place of negotiation. Beyond disputes, alehouses also served as sites of negotiation. Business, marriage, property, and trade were all discussed over drink. In a time when formal offices and private meeting rooms were rare, the back bench of an inn could become a makeshift boardroom. Wills were discussed here. Land was leased or sold. Apprenticeships were arranged. Even royal edicts and town proclamations were read aloud in alehouses, particularly for the illiterate majority who could not read the posted notices. The innkeeper, again, played a central role, not only providing the space, but sometimes witnessing agreements. In some cases, written contracts mentioned the alehouse by name, made in the back room of the Swan Inn, in the presence of William the host. Dealing with crime and disorder. Of course, not all governance was peaceful. When someone caused serious trouble, theft, assault, or threatening behavior, the innkeeper had few formal tools, but several informal ones. Common strategies included public shamming. A disruptive individual might be loudly denounced or mocked, prompting others to avoid them. Refusal of service, a common punishment both practical and humiliating. Forcible removal. Though risky, some innkeepers employed burly assistants to eject unruly patrons. Reporting to constables. For crimes or repeated offenses, the local authorities would be notified. In some cases, alehouses cooperated with one another. Word would travel. He caused trouble at the Green Boar, don't let him in at the Red Hart. In this way, a kind of network justice emerged, informal but effective. A controlled chaos. To the outsider, a medieval alehouse might appear lawless. Dim lighting, coarse language, rough company, and constant noise. But within that apparent chaos was a complex web of expectations, hierarchies, and corrective mechanisms. Patrons understood the lines they should not cross. Innkeepers learned the boundaries they had to enforce. The result was a self-regulating space never perfect, but functional. In fact, it may have been one of the few places in medieval society where different classes, professions, and backgrounds interacted on relatively equal terms, held together not by law, but by ale and custom. But could such a fragile balance hold forever? As alehouses grew in number and significance, authorities began to worry. Could these spaces become threats not just places of drink, but of sedition? Could the conversations over pints shift from farming and marriage to rebellion? What happens when control from within is no longer enough, and regulation must come from above? The morning after a lively night in a busy tavern begins quietly. The benches are empty, the fire is low, and the innkeeper, red-eyed but resolute, tallies accounts, wipes spills, and prepares for the day ahead. But before the door opens to the next stream of guests, another figure arrives, not a pilgrim or a drunk, but a local official with a ledger and a quill. Regulation has arrived. This section explores the external forces that grew increasingly interested in the alehouse authorities, that questioned whether the peace within could truly be maintained without their watchful gaze. As inns and alehouses multiplied and grew more central to public life, they attracted more than just weary travelers. They attracted surveillance. The crown in the cup. In the late Middle Ages, the English crown, like its counterparts across Europe, began to recognize that alehouses were more than local watering holes. They were centers of public discourse, economic exchange, and potentially political agitation. With that realization came control. As early as the 13th century, monarchs and councils issued laws to regulate both the production and sale of ale. These began with concerns over quality and pricing, particularly through the assize of ale, but over time, the focus shifted toward licensing, morality, and order. By the 16th century, alehouses required formal licenses, granted by local justices of the peace. A fee was paid, an oath was taken, and records were kept. The innkeeper became, officially, a state-recognized operator, and with that recognition came scrutiny. Licensing and its burdens. Licensing was more than a bureaucratic step. It placed the alehouse directly under the watch of civil and ecclesiastical authorities. Conditions might include refusing to serve known criminals or sturdy beggars, limiting the number of patrons indoors after dark, ensuring games of chance dice, cards were not played for excessive stakes, avoiding the hosting of seditious gatherings, abstaining from harboring unlicensed minstrels, actors, or rogues. These expectations were enforced through periodic inspections, conducted by constables, bailiffs, or church wardens. An alehouse found in violation could lose its license, and with it, its livelihood. This system placed tremendous pressure on innkeepers, who had to balance the informal justice systems they created with the formal codes imposed from above. Moral oversight in the church's role. While the state focused on licensing and taxation, the church focused on morality. The alehouse was viewed by many clerics as a moral minefield. Gambling, gossip, fornication, cursing, and Sabbath violations were rampant. Church courts, called ecclesiastical courts, issued articles of inquiry to parishioners, asking whether local alehouses were hosting unchaste behavior, allowing immoderate drinking, or drawing people away from Sunday worship. Many parishes maintained alehouse watch lists, reports compiled during visitations that tracked complaints and issued fines. In some places, local clergy even insisted that alehouses close during mass hours and threatened excommunication to repeat offenders. And yet, even while condemning the alehouse, the church sometimes depended on it. Parish ales community fundraising events were often held in the same establishments. These events were festive, often bordering on riotous, and tolerated because they raised money for roof repairs or alms. Thus, the church found itself in a familiar medieval contradiction. warning against vice, while participating in it when it served practical needs. The alehouse as a political threat. Perhaps most threatening to both church and crown was the power of conversation. In an era before newspapers, public houses were where people shared news, formed opinions, and debated grievances. When revolts occurred, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, or local food riots in the 15th and 16th centuries, authorities often traced the origins of dissent to taverns and inns, where radical ideas had fermented alongside the ale. Alehouses, by their very nature, attracted workers, merchants, travelers, and soldiers, people with stories, complaints, and a thirst for change. By the 17th century, especially under the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I, alehouses were actively viewed as sites of sedition. Informants were employed to listen in. Some alehouses were closed simply for attracting idle and suspicious company. In towns, where political dissent was harder to suppress, authorities began targeting specific establishments known for boisterous opinion. Licensing became a tool for censorship. An innkeeper known to host troublemakers could be quietly refused renewal, effectively shuttering the tavern without trial. Alehouse keepers as agents of order. Ironically, as pressure from above increased, innkeepers were increasingly expected not only to maintain peace, but to act as agents of surveillance themselves. They were tasked with reporting guests who stayed more than a night without explanation, informing on foreigners, especially during periods of plague or war, watching for heretical speech during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, notifying authorities of any signs of treason or papist gatherings. These expectations were formalized in alehouse bonds, signed agreements to uphold certain standards or face penalties. For many innkeepers, these obligations were a burden but also a tool. Reporting trouble meant avoiding punishment. Some innkeepers became skilled at playing both sides, protecting their own interests, while nodding to the expectations of state and church. Pushback and quiet resistance. Not all innkeepers complied easily. In some regions, particularly rural ones, alehouses continued to function with minimal interference, protected by local lords or by their importance to community life. Complaints about unlicensed alehouses, tippling houses, or blind inns filled records, but many continued operating for years without sanction. These establishments often relied on mutual loyalty. Patrons refused to testify against their hosts. Constables looked the other way. Even clergy, when treated with generosity and perhaps a free cup, chose to delay formal action. Thus, a quiet resistance existed, not overt rebellion, but a widespread refusal to fully bend the alehouse to outside authority. Alehouses were of the people, and for the people, and the people were often unwilling to let regulation ruin a good pint. The turning point. By the end of the medieval period, alehouses stood at a crossroads. Once self-governing hubs of community and negotiation, they were now subject to increasing control. And yet, despite regulation, surveillance, and moral scrutiny, the alehouse endured. It did so because it filled a need no law could erase: the need for gathering, for voice, and for shared experience. But can a space remain free when every word might be heard, every cup measured, and every guest questioned? And what happens when the alehouse becomes not a refuge from power, but an instrument of it? The hearth glows low in the corner, the patrons gone, the cask sealed. The innkeeper rests for a moment at the long table, ledger open beside a flickering candle. Outside, the street is quiet but not silent. Distant footsteps remind us that this place, this institution of ale and order, stands not alone but within a living world of governance, resistance, and community. This final section reflects on the decline of alehouse autonomy, the cultural inheritance of their governance systems, and how these spaces, though humble, shaped ideas of justice and social order in ways more profound than we often realize. from local justice to central control. As we have seen, the earliest alehouses were spaces where order emerged from within, where the innkeeper, regular patrons, and local customs maintained peace, resolved disputes, and enforced expectations. But by the 16th century, these internal systems were being replaced or absorbed into more centralized legal frameworks. The alehouse was no longer treated as a semi-autonomous zone, it was now an officially monitored space. By the time of the Tudor monarchs, particularly under Elizabeth I, the Statute of 1552 had reshaped alehouse governance entirely. This law required every tavern, alehouse, and inn to be licensed by 2 local justices of the peace, who were also tasked with suppressing the multitude of alehouses blamed for crime, idleness, and disorder. While some innkeepers adapted and formalized their businesses, many smaller and rural alehouses, those deeply embedded in village life, disappeared or returned to illicit operation. And yet the idea of alehouse justice remained. Alehouse customs as precedent. Interestingly, many of the self-regulating customs developed in alehouses did not vanish, they evolved. Practices such as settling disputes informally through community consensus, recognizing verbal agreements in the presence of a public audience, establishing behavioral norm that carried reputational consequences, all persisted in other social institutions, including guilds, parish vestries, and even early colonial town meetings in places like New England. The alewife or host became a model for other forms of informal governance, trusted local figures who acted as mediators, information brokers, and moral arbiters. While their power was never official, it was real. Some historians even argue that the public house, and its embedded culture of open discussion and collective expectation, contributed indirectly to the development of parliamentary consciousness in early modern England. After all, where else did people of all ranks within reason gather to speak, debate, and be heard? Survival through adaptation. Though regulated, taxed, and surveilled, the alehouse survived by adapting. Some became coaching inns, catering to postal routes and horse traffic. Others evolved into public houses in the modern sense, with larger staff, multiple rooms, and formal menus. But their cultural role remained. Spaces where community life played out, where news was exchanged, disputes settled, and laughter shared. Even the innkeeper's role, once a quiet seat of village power, retained its dignity. In rural areas especially, the landlord or landlady was still seen as someone who could settle a quarrel, broker a deal, or offer quiet advice. These were not residual roles, they were enduring ones. Discipline, hospitality, and the social contract. What the alehouse teaches us at its core is that hospitality requires boundaries, not because people are bad, but because shared space demands shared expectation. Alehouse governance was not about strict control, it was about balance. Between welcome and order, between freedom and responsibility, between indulgence and restraint. The innkeeper, in this sense, is a quiet philosopher of human behavior. Their success relies not just on brewing good ale, but on understanding people, their moods, habits, and limits. When to serve, when to say no, when to ask someone to leave, when to forgive. And it is in these choices made nightly, informally, without ceremony, that a kind of law was enacted. Not written in parchment, but lived in practice. From hearth to modern pub, the medieval alehouse faded, but it gave birth to the modern pub, and with it came many of the same principles. The publican as respected local authority, the regulars as informal community council, the backroom as a space for planning, protest, or peacekeeping. Even today, in countless British pubs, you'll find echoes of this heritage. A landlord quietly moving to diffuse tension before it sparks. Locals watching a stranger just a moment longer than usual. A chalkboard nodding upcoming community meetings or charity raffles. It may seem quaint, but it is, in truth, a long inheritance, the descendant of a world where governance and gathering shared the same bench. The quiet power of the alehouse. In a society dominated by feudal lords, royal edicts, and ecclesiastical mandates, the alehouse offered something smaller but no less vital: agency. Within its walls, decisions were made locally, reputation mattered, justice was personal, order emerged not from fear of punishment but from collective investment in the space itself. The alehouse belonged to the people who filled it, and it was their behavior that kept it alive. It's a powerful thought that even in an age of kings and bishops, one of the most stable forms of justice came not from a throne or altar but from a stool beside a fire, a full mug, and a host who knew your name. A closing reflection. As the candle burns low and the innkeeper bars the door for the night, we are left with a quiet truth. Governance does not always need uniforms or courts. Sometimes it needs only shared space, shared customs, and a shared desire for peace. What lessons lie buried in these ordinary places? What have we forgotten about justice that once thrived where ale was poured and stories were shared? And when we seek order in our own fractured times, should we look not just to laws and institutions, but also to the humble spaces where people gather, listen, and choose to behave well? Story 4. The Traveling Minstrel: Music, Ale, and Oral Histories by the Firelight. It is late evening. The drinking has slowed to a steady hum, the fire burns low, and the talk has softened. The clatter of dice is absent now. In the far corner of the alehouse, a figure removes his cloak, revealing a worn instrument, a lute perhaps, or a small harp. He takes no payment up front. Instead, he tunes the strings slowly, deliberately. A hush falls over the room. The minstrel has arrived. In a world before books were common, before radio, before recorded music, the arrival of a traveling performer was an event. Especially in rural towns or along busy travel routes, the minstrel offered more than entertainment. He brought news, legends, laughter, and sometimes uncomfortable truths wrapped in rhyme. This story explores the minstrel's world, not the courtly troubadour of high halls, but the working performer of alehouses and inns. A figure both welcomed and distrusted, part entertainer, part historian, and part wanderer. Who was the minstrel? Minstrels were not one thing. The word encompassed a wide range of performers in medieval Europe: male and female, skilled and amateur, itinerant and employed. They played music, yes, but also recited poetry, told stories, sang ballads, and sometimes performed juggling or comic routines. Most were travelers. Some followed established pilgrimage routes, others moved between fairs, market towns, or known, friendly alehouses. A few might be invited into minor noble households for seasonal work, but most made their living by passing the hat or by sleeping where the ale was still warm and the innkeeper was in a generous mood. They often carried small, portable instruments: the lute, the rebec, a bowed string instrument, a recorder or pipe, or even simple percussion. Their voices were their most valuable tool and their memory their library. For many people in medieval towns and villages, the minstrel was the closest thing to a newsman, playwright, and radio all in one. Arrival in the alehouse. The presence of a minstrel could change the energy of an alehouse completely. During a lull, especially on long winter nights, a minstrel might be welcomed eagerly. The clatter of conversation would cease. The fire was stirred, and patrons leaned in. The performance itself could take many forms. A ballad about a distant battle, with heroes and villains. A comic song mocking local authorities, safely vague enough to avoid offense. A romantic tale sung in long, melancholic verse. A story and song about a saint or martyr, especially near religious holidays. Or sometimes news wrapped in rhyme, half true, half embellished, but wholly captivating. The minstrel was not passive. He or she adjusted the act to the crowd, bawdy for rowdy drinkers, somber for tired travelers, and patriotic when tensions ran high. A good minstrel read the room like a second language. And when the song was done, the performer might move on or stay and drink, repaid not always in coin, but in bread, ale, and a place to sleep. Minstrels and memory. In a world where literacy was rare, and even among the literate, books were scarce, minstrels served as living libraries. They preserved stories, histories, and songs that might otherwise have been lost. Much of what we now know as oral tradition legends of local heroes, romantic tragedies, tales of war and pilgrimage survived, because minstrels carried them from town to town, from ear to ear. They also adapted. A story might change based on local tastes or recent events. A tale told in York could have different names and locations by the time it reached Devon, but the core remained, passed through memory and melody. Many performers had no written lyrics. They memorized hundreds of verses and trained themselves to modify lines on the spot. In this way, they resembled both reporters and improvisers, able to recall detail, but also to insert timely jokes or flattering lines about the local ale. Some minstrels even carried personal stories: a lost lover, a broken oath, a narrow escape. Whether these were true or merely practiced performances, the effect was the same. The crowd leaned closer, the alehouse held its breath. A shared experience. What made the minstrel's presence so powerful was not just the performance but the communal act of listening. In the cramped room of a village inn, the audience was not passive. They nodded along. They laughed. They cried. They jeered or sang along on familiar refrains. Some songs were interactive, with call-and-response verses. Others ended with a toast or a curse, followed by the raising of mugs. In this moment, the entire alehouse was drawn into a single story, if only for a few minutes. This was more than distraction. In a world where hardship was constant hunger, war, taxation, disease, the minstrel's art offered a moment of suspension, a window into another world, a release. And in doing so, the alehouse was transformed from a noisy tavern to a temporary theater, alive with emotion, trust, and suspicion. Yet the minstrel's welcome was never guaranteed. Because they traveled, because they were often poor, and because they were unknown, minstrels were sometimes viewed with suspicion. They could be spies, thieves, or heretical agitators. In times of war or plague, traveling entertainers were among the first to be turned away at the gates of a town. Some inns refused them outright. Others allowed performances but barred overnight stays. And some minstrels, desperate or cynical, leaned into the darker side of their reputation, using distraction to aid pickpockets or spreading false rumors for coin. It was a delicate balance, to be entertaining enough to be invited in, but harmless enough to be allowed to leave. Because of this, many minstrels relied on reputation. A good performer's name might travel ahead of them. A tune remembered from the last visit could open doors that might otherwise remain shut. Minstrels as carriers of culture. For all their uncertainty, the traveling minstrel played a vital role in shaping the cultural consciousness of medieval Europe. They preserved local dialects in song. They carried stories from one kingdom to another, influencing folk tradition across borders. They reinforced moral tales through religious ballads or cautionary love songs. They introduced new musical forms, instruments, and performance techniques. They also blurred class lines. A minstrel could perform for nobles one night and peasants the next. Their stories might reference courtly love one moment and farming woes the next. In the alehouse, they reminded everyone, for better or worse, that the world beyond their village was vast, strange, and always changing. The end of a night's song. The fire crackles, a final chord rings out, and the room slowly exhales. Some clap, some reach for their purses, others return to their mugs in thoughtful silence. The minstrel smiles, not triumphant but content, a good performance, a place to sleep, and tomorrow another road. For centuries, these wanderers carried the sounds and stories of a continent on their backs. But who were they truly? What was their life like beyond the performance on the road, in solitude, in fear, or joy? And what happens when a song is forgotten, when the last minstrel to carry a tale dies, and the firelight fades? The morning after a performance is quiet. The hearth has gone cold, the last cask is sealed, and a few scattered coins lie in the minstrel's pouch, just enough, perhaps, for bread, ale, and the next stretch of road. He hoists his pack and instrument, nods to the innkeeper, and steps into the gray light of another uncertain day. We now follow the minstrel outside the alehouse, onto the muddy, rutted paths that connected medieval towns and villages. Because to understand the traveling performer's world, one must understand not just the performance, but the spaces in between, the survival strategies, the risks, and the unseen work that lay behind the songs. The minstrel's itinerary: no map, no schedule. Unlike guild-trained artisans or itinerant merchants with regular markets, most minstrels traveled with no formal structure. There were no fixed circuits, no national performer networks, and no guarantees. Travel depended on seasonal events, harvest festivals, fairs, church feasts. Local reputation: towns known to be welcoming or dangerous. Word of mouth: their hearing in Dunwich, the last singer was robbed near Ely. And sometimes luck. Minstrels learned to listen, to move where opportunity seemed warmest, and to build informal routes shaped by memory and experience. Distances were vast by foot, and weather often dictated the day's ambitions. A rainy morning might mean staying at a crossroads in another night if you could charm the host, or trudging on to the next town, soaking and unwelcome. Making a living: payment in coin, kind, and shelter. Minstrels lived on the edge of subsistence. Few grew rich, many barely broke even. They earned through passing the hat after a performance, fixed fees, in rare cases where an innkeeper had coin to spare, food and lodging in trade for performance, a common arrangement, patronage if they caught the attention of a noble household or merchant, market days, when larger crowds meant better returns. A good night might yield a full belly, a warm bed, and a handful of pence. A bad night meant empty hands, a cold stable, and hunger. Some minstrels supplemented their earnings by selling ballad sheets, if literate, copying songs for local choirs, or teaching music to children of wealthy patrons. And some, especially those with no fixed community, borrowed, traded, or in desperate times stole. The risks of the road. Travel was dangerous. Minstrels were ideal targets, visibly carrying goods, instruments, cloaks, pouches, unarmed and often alone. They faced highwaymen on forest roads, hostile villages, especially during plague years, suspicion from town guards, fearing theft or sedition, injury and illness, without the safety net of a home or household, weather which could strand or expose them to cold, floods, or hunger. To survive, many minstrels learned codes of caution. Travel in groups when possible. Avoid towns known for closing the gates early. Always perform well, for the innkeeper their goodwill could mean the difference between a room or a ditch. They also carried permissions when possible, written notes from local lords or priests attesting to their harmlessness. These acted as both introductions and protection. Still, nothing was guaranteed. Patronage, a fragile lifeline. Some minstrels, particularly those with exceptional skill, secured patronage from noble households or wealthy merchants. This arrangement could take many forms. Seasonal employment, serving during Christmas or harvest festivals. Long-term residence, particularly for minstrels attached to courtly households. Traveling endorsement, being sent out on a lord's behalf, carrying news or recruiting for festivals. These positions were coveted but rare, and even when gained, they were precarious. A change in household, a noble's mood, or political unrest could leave a minstrel unemployed overnight. Worse, a patron might attempt to control the minstrel's repertoire, demanding flattery or politically charged material. The performer then walked a fine line between honesty, performance, and self-preservation. Female minstrels, seen and unrecorded. Though less documented, female minstrels did exist and often faced even greater challenges. They were called glee maidens, songwomen, or story wives, and might perform laments, especially at funerals, romantic or moral ballads in markets and homes, herbal or healing songs, blending music and folk medicine. These women were sometimes mistrusted, seen as dangerously independent. Accusations of impropriety or even witchcraft followed some. Yet they offered a vital perspective. Songs from a female voice, preserving maternal stories, domestic wisdom, and old regional tales often excluded from formal chronicles. Their performances often occurred in private spaces, hearths, birthing rooms, wakes, but their words echoed far beyond. Learning the craft, no school, only experience. There were no minstrel academies, no conservatories. Training came through apprenticeship to older performers, observation, memorization, and repetition. Exchange, with minstrels trading tunes, lyrics, and techniques at fairs or taverns. Some minstrels belonged to loose guilds or brotherhoods in cities like London or Paris. These offered minimal protection, but more importantly, validated the performer's skill in the eyes of potential patrons. But in most of Europe, the path of the minstrel was solitary, built through trial, failure, and persistence. And many did not last long on the road. Why they kept going? Why did they continue, given the hardship? Because for many, the minstrel's life offered freedom, however narrow, meaning in giving voice to stories otherwise lost, community found across thresholds and hearths, respect, however brief, when a song moved a room to stillness. And because the road, dangerous though it was, still beckoned with the possibility of wonder, of a new song, a new friend, a full room leaning in. A question beneath the songs. As the minstrel crests the hill, the village behind, another ahead, he wonders how many of his songs will survive. Will the tale of the lost knight, the girl who spoke to angels, or the outlaw who stole from kings still be sung a century hence? Or will they vanish when he does, unrecorded and unheard? And if they vanish, what part of us vanishes with them? The road stretches behind the minstrel now. Towns blur into memory, faces into fragments. A few melodies linger, played into hearth-warmed air and never captured in ink. As the late Middle Ages give way to a new world of printing presses, professional theater, and centralized power, the old wandering songman begins to vanish. In this final section, we explore the disappearance of the traveling minstrel, the forces that displaced them, and the long shadows their oral traditions cast across the centuries, not always remembered, but never entirely erased. A changing world. By the 16th century, the social and political landscape of Europe was shifting dramatically. Several developments began to crowd the minstrel off the stage. The printing press, introduced to England in the late 15th century, made ballads, songs, and stories available in permanent form. Cheap broadsheets replaced wandering voices. Professional theater emerged, especially in England and Italy, offering structured drama in permanent venues. Court entertainment became more exclusive, favoring trained musicians and playwrights over traveling performers. Religious reform, both Protestant and Catholic, grew increasingly suspicious of unregulated storytelling, especially bawdy or critical song. In this new world, the wandering minstrel seemed increasingly anachronistic, too untrained for the stage, too secular for the church, and too itinerant for growing bureaucratic societies. The age of the alehouse bard was fading. licensing, surveillance, and suppression. As with alehouses themselves, regulation played a role in the minstrel's decline. Laws were passed requiring licenses for performers. In England, the 1597 Vagabonds Act declared that anyone wandering abroad and playing of instruments without a license could be arrested as a rogue. The intent was clear: control public storytelling, eliminate disorder, and prevent the spread of subversive ideas. Authorities feared minstrels not for their music, but for their power to influence minds through satire, moral critique, and emotion. With no patron and no papers, many performers disappeared into poverty, obscurity, or labor. Some took up work in inns as staff, others joined traveling theater troupes. A few disappeared entirely, their songs fading with them. Legacy in print and song. Yet the minstrel did not vanish completely. His voice and that of the glee maidens, storytellers, and folk singers persisted in new forms. Ballads once sung in alehouses were printed and sold in marketplaces. Folk songs, passed down in families, carried fragments of minstrel performance into the oral traditions of Europe. Chroniclers and antiquarians began collecting lyrics, preserving them in books for later ages to rediscover. And the structure of their performances, the wandering narrative, the refrain, the moral conclusion, found echoes in 17th and 18th century poetry and theater. In short, the performance survived, even when the performer did not. We find it today in the rhythms of folk revival songs, in the structure of campfire stories, and in the idea that a single voice, with nothing but memory and melody, can hold a room captive. The alehouse's archive. The alehouse, though transformed into the modern pub, continued to hold on to some of the minstrel's functions. Local musicians still performed informally, passing songs from one generation to the next. Stories of older performers, true or exaggerated, were told by innkeepers and regulars. Wall-mounted broadsheets and pub signs occasionally bore references to famous songs or events first sung by minstrels. In this way, the alehouse became not just a place of drink, but an unintentional archive, a cultural hearth where fragments of lost oral traditions still flickered. Some public houses even named rooms after old songs: the minstrel's parlor, the ballad room, long after anyone remembered who first sang there. The spirit of the minstrel today. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the folk revival movements in Britain, Ireland, and beyond rekindled interest in traditional ballads and tunes. Scholars and musicians traced song lines back hundreds of years, discovering references to medieval events, lost towns, and themes that once filled alehouses with song. The idea of the traveling performer, poor, rootless, wise in sorrow, still appears in books, movies, and modern songwriting. Figures like the wandering bard, the blues musician, or even the street performer carry echoes of that old minstrel life. And perhaps more subtly, the idea that a public space should have music, that stories deserve to be sung in shared places, remains part of how we understand culture, hospitality, and memory. The question of remembering. As we close this story, one question remains: how much of history is lost not because it was never recorded, but because it was never sung again? The minstrel's legacy is a fragile thing, dependent on voice, memory, and audience. Once any one of those is broken, the chain fails. But even now, when someone in a pub sings an old ballad, when a child learns a folk song without knowing where it came from, when a tale is told in verse across a crowded room, the minstrel returns. He never needed applause, only attention, only a moment of stillness, only a listener. So perhaps the next time you're in a quiet corner of an old tavern and the fire is low, ask yourself, what story waits to be remembered, and who will sing it next? Story 5. A penny for a pot: pricing, currency, and the economics of ale. The tavern is lively this evening. Patrons crowd shoulder to shoulder, the clatter of wooden mugs echoing beneath a low-beamed ceiling. At the counter, a copper coin passes from calloused hand to ink-stained ledger. A pot of ale, simple, warm, and murky, is poured without fanfare. "A penny for a pot," says the innkeeper. But what does that penny buy exactly, and what does it cost? In this story, we step away from personalities and performances to examine the economics of ale. The currency, pricing, supply chains, taxation, and everyday arithmetic that underpinned one of medieval Europe's most essential commodities. Ale was not merely a drink, it was a microeconomy, and its story is told not only in songs and stories, but in ledgers, fines, and coinage. The currency of the medieval mug. To understand the price of ale, we must first understand what a penny meant. Medieval English currency operated on a system inherited from earlier centuries. 1 pound equals 20 shillings S. 1 shilling equals 12 pence D. There were no paper notes, and coinage was limited. Most people rarely saw a full pound in their lives. Instead, daily transactions happened at the penny level, or more often, in fractions of a penny. By the 13th to 15th centuries, coins in circulation included the silver penny, most common, the halfpenny, a half D, and farthing, a quarter D. Occasionally, larger denominations like the groat 4D for wealthier transactions. A penny could buy a pint or pot of ale, depending on quality, a small loaf of bread, a portion of porridge, half a day's labor from a poor worker. So when someone placed a penny on the counter for ale, they were spending a meaningful portion of their daily income, not a trifle. Standard measures and mug sizes. But what exactly was being bought for that penny? Ale was typically sold by volume, measured in pots or jugs, variable in size, tankards, flagons, or pints, with local variations, gallon and half-gallon measures for group purchases or takeaway. The assize of bread and ale, first issued in England in 1266, aimed to regulate these transactions. It required ale to be sold at fixed prices relative to the cost of grain and established standard measures to avoid cheating. Alehouses were expected to serve in certified mugs with markings. Dishonest innkeepers might use false-bottomed mugs, adding weight or thickness to reduce volume, a practice that drew fines or punishment if discovered. To enforce compliance, officials called ale tasters or ale conners inspected both the strength of the ale and the honesty of the measure. Some towns even maintained official mugs for comparison, kept in the local guild hall or church. The price of production. From grain to mug, every step in ale's production involved cost, often hidden from the casual drinker. Key inputs included barley or oats, prices fluctuated with the harvest. Fuel, wood or peat for heating mash and boiling work. Water drawn, carried, and stored. Labor, brewing was time-consuming, often requiring full days of work. Fermentation space, usually inside the home or a dedicated brewing room. Herbs or hops, depending on regional tradition and availability. Vessels, wooden tubs, ceramic pitchers, or storage barrels. For many alewives or small-scale brewers, margins were tight. A few pence of profit per batch could mean the difference between solvency and poverty. Moreover, ale did not keep. Without hops in early periods, it soured quickly. Unsold stock was a loss and often dumped or fed to pigs. This perishability meant that pricing had to be carefully balanced. Ale had to sell quickly, and at a price the community could afford but high enough to pay for the brewer's effort. Market forces, supply, demand, and season. Ale was a local product, tied to agricultural rhythms. In the aftermath of harvest, grain was more abundant and cheaper, making autumn and early winter prime brewing seasons. Conversely, in spring or after poor harvests, grain prices soared. As a result, Ale became more expensive. Quality declined, as brewers used thinner mash or cheaper grains. Substitution occurred: more herbs, less malt, or watered-down batches. Some drinkers turned to small ale, a weaker, cheaper version with less grain and quicker fermentation. In many towns, these fluctuations were monitored by civic authorities. Sudden price hikes could spark unrest, especially if ale was viewed as a daily necessity. In some cases, communal brewing efforts emerged. Neighbors pooled grain to produce shared batches, ensuring a base level of nourishment during hard times. Taxation and ale. Wherever there is commerce, there is tax, and few commodities were taxed as consistently as ale. Local lords, royal governments, and town councils imposed levies on ale production, often a fee per brew or batch. Ale sale, a fixed tax per volume sold. Licensing, a fee to operate an alehouse, renewed periodically. Fines for selling bad ale, underweight mugs, or brewing without permission. Revenue from ale taxes was substantial. It funded town infrastructure, military campaigns, and even churches. During wars such as the 100 Years' War, ale taxes increased, leading to popular resentment. In some cases, tax collectors were harassed or assaulted in alehouses, especially when accompanied by soldiers. But few dared to refuse entirely. Brewing or selling without paying the proper dues could result in hefty fines, confiscation of brewing equipment, public punishment such as time in the stocks, or in rare cases, imprisonment. The alehouse thus became both a site of economic survival and a pressure point for state revenue, a contradiction that would deepen in later centuries. Credit and ale, drinking on the ledger. Not all ale was bought in coin. In close-knit communities, credit and barter were common. A patron might promise to pay next week after harvest. A brewer might trade ale for meat, cloth, or eggs. Some alewives kept detailed tallies, scratched into wooden counters or marked with notches on tally sticks. This created both flexibility and tension. Debts lingered, favors accumulated. A good tab was a sign of trust. A bad one could end friendships or start fights. When someone died owing ale, the debt might even be settled at the churchyard, with neighbors chipping in coin at the wake, or the debtor's family brewing a final batch as a memorial gift. In this way, ale was more than commerce. It was credit, currency, hospitality, and remembrance. The economics of enough. For most, ale wasn't about luxury, it was about subsistence. It offered calories when food was scarce, hydration, safer than many water sources, warmth in body and spirit, community, a reason to gather and share. Pricing had to reflect that role. Too high and resentment simmered, too low and brewers went hungry. Somewhere in between, a balance was struck, mug by mug. And yet prices were never just numbers. They were signals of harvest, of hardship, of authority, and of resistance. A thought with the last copper coin. The pot is empty, the penny spent, and the innkeeper turns back to the counter where more coins and more decisions await. But consider this. How many hands touched that coin before it bought this ale? A baker, a priest, a soldier, a thief. How many stories traveled with it? And if we follow the coin instead of the song, what forgotten history might we find not in parchment or politics, but in small exchanges at a noisy tavern table? The innkeeper's thumb smudges the edge of the parchment as she tallies another evening's sales. Scratched lines, tick marks, and shorthand notations track pints poured and pennies received. The ink is blotchy, but the account is clear. Profit, if any, hangs on the edge of precision and risk. This section explores the day-to-day mechanics of alehouse economics, not just the price of a pint, but the flow of coin, record-keeping, fraud, and the often invisible networks of regulation and resistance that surrounded the humble mug of ale. The alehouse ledger, Record-keeping and practice. Most alehouses, especially in towns and trading hubs, kept simple written accounts. These were not ornate documents, they were working tools, bound in cheap parchment or cloth, or even kept on tally sticks, split-notched wood. These records tracked daily ale sold by the pot, pint, or gallon. Debts owed by regulars, noted by name or initials. Supplies purchased: malt, firewood, herbs. Taxes or dues paid to officials. Fines or court costs, if any had been incurred. While literacy was limited, many innkeepers, male or female, were functionally literate in numbers and names. Even those who couldn't read or write fluently used symbols, tallies, or tokens to keep accounts. For example, some alewives used chalk on walls to track customer tabs, carved pebbles or colored beads to represent pence, split tally sticks, with one half given to the customer and the other kept as proof of owed or paid drink. It was not elegant, but it worked, and it made ale not just drink but data. Standard versus local pricing. What a penny got you. The notion of a penny for a pot was never absolute. Pricing varied wildly by region. Grain was cheaper in East Anglia than in upland Wales. Quality: strong ale versus small ale. Time of year: post-harvest versus famine years. Local enforcement: some towns enforced price controls, others ignored them. For example, in London, where prices were more closely regulated, an average penny might get a full pint of standard ale. In rural markets, it might only get a half pot, especially if supplies were short. Small ale, a weaker drink with low alcohol, could be half the price of strong ale, often a half-d or even less. Thus, ale functioned as a graded product, much like bread or cloth. The customer often knew what they were getting by taste and strength, and knew when they were being cheated. Cheating the mug, frauds and fines. Despite regulations, cheating in ale sales was widespread and often subtle. Common frauds included false measures, mugs with thick bottoms or deceptive shapes to hold less ale. Short pours, ale drawn too quickly from the cask, leading to foam instead of liquid. Watered ale, a thin batch stretched by adding water before sale. Switched pots, giving customers a smaller size while charging for a larger one. Such practices were risky. Officials like ale tasters or sergeants at mace, local enforcers, had the right to inspect and fine dishonest brewers. Court rolls from medieval England are full of small fines. Joan Brewster fined 4d for short measure. William the Tapper punished for selling stale ale during Lent. Marjorie of Norwich censured for brewing ale unfit for sale. The punishments were financial, but the reputational damage could be worse. A dishonest in lost customers. In tight-knit communities, that could be ruinous. And yet, cheating persisted not out of greed, but often out of economic necessity. When barley prices spiked or taxes rose, innkeepers had to choose between honesty and survival. Pricing power and gender. An interesting dynamic appears in the economics of ale: gendered pricing power. Alewives who dominated brewing in the early and high Middle Ages often controlled production and pricing at the household level. But as formal regulation increased, women were slowly pushed out of economic authority. Guilds, town councils, and licensing boards were typically male-dominated. Over time, formal brewing became a man's domain, especially in larger urban centers where profit margins and scale increased. This meant that women's informal pricing systems, based on barter or community trust, were displaced by fixed cash systems. Women brewers had less access to capital to comply with regulations or buy grain at scale. Licensing fees, a requirement for legal operation, became a barrier to entry for many women. Still, many women persisted. Their ales were often cheaper, local, and more trusted. But the tension between domestic production and public regulation grew sharper with every passing decade. Communal pricing and guild involvement. In some towns, brewers, guilds fixed pricing collectively to avoid undercutting and to ensure uniformity across alehouses. Guilds could set standard pricing tables based on malt cost, agree on strength categories for different ale types, enforce minimum and maximum prices, especially in times of scarcity. This communal approach helped stabilize the market, but often excluded small-scale, non-guild brewers, especially women and rural households. The guild might offer consistency, but it also consolidated power. And guild-aligned alehouses could charge premium prices, claiming superior quality even if the customer couldn't always taste the difference. Currency shortages and barter. Coinage was not always available, especially in remote or poor areas. Periodic shortages of small denomination coins, like farthings and halfpennies, made change difficult. In response, some alehouses adopted credit systems, drink now, pay when the barley comes in. Barter eggs, candles, salted fish. Beer tokens, wooden or metal discs representing payment, used in lieu of coin, sometimes accepted at multiple alehouses in a region. These informal currencies reflected both economic flexibility and a lack of financial infrastructure. The alehouse, once again, filled the gap, not just a seller of ale, but a local financial institution of sorts. Ale as inflation barometer. Perhaps most fascinating is how the price of ale functioned as an economic indicator. When the price per pot rose suddenly, it signaled a poor harvest, a war-driven tax, a labor shortage, raising wages, reducing available brew labor, or currency devaluation. Governments tracked ale prices as a sign of popular mood. High ale prices led to discontent, particularly among urban workers who relied on ale as daily sustenance. In some cases, pricing became political. Monarchs or lords might issue temporary price controls to pacify unrest. Thus, a penny spent at the tavern was not just a drink, it was a vote, a signal, a symptom of a greater economic story. The hidden arithmetic of the mug. Behind every pot poured at the counter lay a web of calculations. What was the weather last harvest? Will the parish inspector visit this week? Has that farmhand paid his tab? Can we stretch the wort one more day? Ale was constant, but its economics never were. It lived at the intersection of supply and trust, coin and custom, law and loophole. And every drinker, whether peasant, merchant, or pilgrim, participated in that system, knowingly or not. The unasked question. As the final pot of the evening is poured and another penny clinks into the till, we're left with a thought. If the price of a drink tells the story of the economy, what do today's prices say about us? And when did we stop counting the cost in stories and start measuring it only in coin? The barrel is nearly empty. The innkeeper tilts it one last time, chasing the dregs for a final pour. The night is quieting, and a weary handful of drinkers nurse their last pots. But beyond the tavern door, winds of change are rising, and with them, the long history of ale's economic role begins to shift. This final section explores what happened when pricing systems failed, how reform and revolt reshaped the economics of ale, and how the humble cost of a drink reflected some of the deepest tensions in medieval life between rulers and ruled, scarcity and survival, tradition and transformation. When the mug became too expensive. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe endured periodic economic crises that directly impacted ale pricing. The Black Death, 1347–1351, reduced the population dramatically, triggering labor shortages, wage rises, and disruption of grain supply. Successive bad harvests, worsened by a cooling climate, increased grain prices, making ale costlier to brew. Wars, such as the 100 Years' War, led to increased taxation often passed along in the price of drink. Inflation, especially in urban areas, outpaced wage growth. These crises meant that the price of a simple pot of ale could double or triple in a few short years. For the poorest laborers' apprentices, widow's ale became a luxury, not a staple. Small ale remained affordable, but stronger brews drifted out of reach. In cities like London or York, discontent simmered as drink prices rose faster than daily wages. And when drink becomes scarce, anger ferments quickly. Ale and the pulse of rebellion. In several notable uprisings, ale prices were more than a grievance, they were a symbol of broader injustice. The Peasants' Revolt 1381. While sparked by a poll tax, the revolt drew energy from years of frustration, including over the regulation and cost of basic goods. In alehouses across the southeast of England, rebellious sentiment brewed alongside beer. Chroniclers record how rebels gathered in taverns, discussing grievances. Inns were looted, especially those seen as overcharging or catering to officials. Ale tasters and tax collectors were targeted for violence. Ale was not the cause, but it was the context. The alehouse became a crucible of collective resentment, and the rising price of a pot served as shorthand for broader economic oppression. Local uprisings and food riots. In the 15th and early 16th centuries, food riots broke out in market towns across England and France. These often began when grain was exported during local shortages. Bakers or brewers were seen hoarding. Prices of bread and ale rose beyond what laborers could pay. Alehouses were frequently the starting point for these actions, places where rumors spread, crowds gathered, and leaders emerged. Again and again, we see that pricing, especially of ale, was not simply economic. It was political. It was about fairness, survival, and dignity. Government response, price fixing and ale statutes. In response to these tensions, authorities implemented a series of ale reforms, including strict price controls based on the cost of grain, enforced locally by ale tasters and town constables. Licensing schemes to reduce the number of sellers and ensure quality. Quantity regulations, mandating specific mug sizes and fair serving. Moral reforms, especially during religious movements, aimed at reducing drunkenness and excess. The result was a tightening of control. Brewing became a heavily monitored enterprise, especially in towns. Alehouses were required to renew licenses annually, submit to inspections, both of ale quality and measure, display price tables publicly in some regions. While this system curbed some abuses, it also had unintended consequences. Small brewers were driven out, unable to afford licensing fees. Ale quality became more standardized, but less diverse. Homemade and unlicensed brewing increased, particularly in rural areas and among the poor. In effect, regulation professionalized ale, but at the cost of its community-based, flexible, and informal economy. The decline of ale's economic centrality. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the role of ale in the economy began to shift. Beer, brewed with hops and lasting longer, became more dominant. Commercial breweries, often male-run and urban, replaced household brewers. Imported wines and spirits offered alternatives for wealthier drinkers. Taxation on alcohol increased further, integrating ale directly into state revenue systems. Ale was still drunk widely, especially by the lower classes, but its production was now part of a larger commercial and fiscal machinery. The days of the alewife balancing her accounts on a tally stick while children ran through the taproom were fading. The economics of ale were no longer local nor personal. The modern echo, pricing and power. And yet, even in decline, the economic legacy of ale remains with us. In modern pubs, the price of a pint still stirs debate. Questions about taxation, fairness, and affordability echo centuries-old concerns. Who sets the price of daily pleasure? What happens when basic comforts become unaffordable? How do ordinary people resist, adapt, or mourn when something essential is priced out of reach? From medieval innkeepers counting pence to modern bartenders tallying tabs, the economics of drink tells a quiet story of survival, resistance, and community. It reminds us that even in times of hardship, people seek moments of warmth, and that behind every drink shared is a chain of labor, cost, and choice. A final thought in the foam. As the last pot is drained and the coin counted, we're left with a small but powerful question. Was ale ever really about the drink, or was it always about the price of connection? And if so, what price are we willing to pay for the spaces that bring us together pot by pot, penny by penny? Story 6. Sleeping in stables, the reality of overnighting at a medieval inn. The road is long and the light is fading. A traveler dusty, sore, and footsore sees the crooked sign of an inn swinging in the dusk. Beneath it, horses snort in a yard, smoke drifts from a chimney, and somewhere inside, a door creaks open. But the question on every traveler's mind is simple and pressing. Where will I sleep tonight? In this story, we examine the realities of overnight stays in medieval inns, alehouses, monasteries, and stables. Far from romantic, these sleeping arrangements were governed by class, coin, custom, and compromise. For most, the night offered not rest but negotiation. And for many, sleep came not in beds, but on straw or worse. The landscape of lodging. Before the rise of commercial hotels, medieval travel relied on a patchwork of lodging options. Broadly, overnight stays fell into a few categories. Inns established accommodations, typically in towns, catering to travelers with coin. Alehouses or taverns, not always licensed to host guests overnight, but often did so informally. Monasteries and church houses, religious institutions that provided hospitality to pilgrims, clergy, or nobles. Private homes, especially in rural areas, where strangers might beg lodging from local peasants or gentry. Stables, barns, or roadside shelters, fallback options for those too poor or too late. Each offered varying degrees of shelter, security, and comfort, but even the best inns were cramped, smoky, and communal by modern standards. Inside the medieval inn. The medieval inn bore little resemblance to the later Georgian coaching inns or modern hotels. Most were two-story timber buildings with a courtyard for horses and wagons, built with common rooms on the ground floor and shared sleeping quarters above. Run by a host or hosteler, sometimes with staff for kitchen, stables, and cleaning, the latter often in name only. Beds were shared unless paid for in full. You might find yourself sleeping beside a merchant, a messenger, or a stranger with fleas. Private rooms existed but were rare and expensive. The typical bed had a straw or feather mattress on ropes or boards, was covered with blankets or cloaks, often reused night after night. Included no personal space. Curtains, if present, were more to block drafts than privacy. In some cases, if beds were full, guests slept on benches in front of the hearth or on the floor with hounds. Warmth mattered more than comfort. Sleeping in the alehouse. Alehouses weren't officially meant for lodging, but many served double duty, especially in market towns or along popular roads. For regulars or desperate travelers, alewives might offer a corner by the hearth, a space in the loft or attic where sacks of grain and dusty bedding mingled, floor space in the common room, cleared once mugs were emptied and benches pushed aside. These arrangements were rarely clean and never formal. Payment was often in coin, favors, or barter. One chronicler noted how the traveler did sleep behind the ale cask, wrapped in his cloak and curled round like a hedgehog, and none disturbed him, save for the tap of the innkeeper's boot come sunrise. Monasteries and the church's hospitality. For pilgrims, monks, or those bearing letters of introduction, monasteries provided free or subsidized hospitality, especially on pilgrimage routes like those to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Rome. These religious lodgings included guest halls or dormitories, often separated by class or status, simple meals taken in silence or shared with brothers, rules of conduct, such as no loud talk, no weapons, and mandatory prayers. For nobles or high-ranking clergy, private chambers might be offered. For commoners, lodging was Spartan, bare boards or straw pallets, but safe and respectable. The Benedictine rule instructed monasteries to treat all guests as Christ himself. But in practice, space was limited and favoritism common. Straw stables and shelter for the poor. Not everyone could pay for a bed, even a shared one. For the poor, displaced, or simply unlucky traveler, lodging options dwindled. Stables were a common fallback, warm, sheltered, and less likely to draw theft. Barns were sometimes rented by farmers as informal hostels. Church porches, if not locked, provided stone overhangs and dry ground. Markets and inns. Yards often had lean-tos or carts where people curled up for warmth. These unofficial arrangements weren't always legal, but custom allowed them in most places unless crime or disease became an issue. Indeed, many travelers preferred sleeping with horses to the lice, filth, and snoring of a crowded inn. Security and sleep. Sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they were about safety. Theft was common, especially in shared spaces. Fires were a danger, open hearths burned all night. Rats and lice infested straw mattresses and furs. Drunken brawls could erupt if alehouses doubled as sleeping quarters. Travelers sometimes slept with their boots on, money pouch tied around their neck, dagger under their cloak. Locks were rare, trust was personal. The innkeeper was gatekeeper, judge, and occasional peacemaker. Pricing the night. Lodging was not free, except in monasteries, and even there, donations were expected. Prices varied, but surviving records offer some glimpses. 1 penny might buy a spot in a common bed. 2 to 4 pence might secure a full bed or pallet to oneself. 6 pence or more could secure a private room, if available. Payment could be in kind: candles, food, labor, or stories. Some travelers also bargained to stay free in exchange for songs, news, or services, especially minstrel, scribes, or healers. Waking to the road again. Sleep in a medieval inn was often brief and uncomfortable, but it was essential. The road was unsafe at night, and morning meant travel resumed at dawn. Guests woke stiff, chilled, and often worse for wear. Alehouse porridge or stale bread might be the only breakfast before the next stretch. For all its flaws, a roof was better than exposure, and even the worst night's rest could be recounted later as part of the journey's tale. A final question beneath the thatch. As you imagine curling up on straw or trading a song for a space by the fire, one wonders, what does it mean to rest, when rest is never truly secure? And if every night's sleep must be earned, bargained, or begged, how does that shape a life? The hearth has burned low. Somewhere nearby, a dog shifts in its sleep, a cart creaks as it settles into the dirt, and muffled snores echo from the loft above. In the cramped darkness of a medieval inn or alehouse, sleep was not private. It was communal, noisy, and full of subtle rules, many unwritten, but deeply understood. In this section, we explore what it meant to sleep in company, the customs of bed sharing, the social codes that governed overnighting, and how medieval society approached intimacy, modesty, and hierarchy in shared spaces. From who got the bed's warm side to how people handled strangers in the night, Sleep was not simply a pause in the day, it was a performance of status, survival, and social intelligence. Who slept where? The social hierarchy of the bed. Sleeping arrangements were rarely random. Whether in an inn, alehouse, or private home, hierarchy shaped the night. Factors that influenced sleeping order included social rank, nobility, clergy, merchant, laborer; age and gender, elders before youth, women separate from men if space allowed; ability to pay, a full fee meant a better spot or even privacy; familiarity, locals were often favored over strangers. In wealthier inns, sleeping spaces might be assigned by the host or chamberlain, who used judgment to avoid conflict. In simpler settings, travelers arranged themselves by custom and negotiation. Beds were often shared by multiple unrelated individuals, especially in colder seasons. A large feather mattress might accommodate 2 or 3, while a straw tick could hold 5 or more if laid side by side. There was rarely protest. Sleep was necessary and space was limited, but etiquette mattered. Bedmates and boundaries. Sharing a bed did not imply intimacy, but it did require trust. The idea of a bedfellow was common in medieval society. Even nobles, including kings and bishops, often slept with companions not for romance, but for warmth, conversation, or safety. Records show clerks sharing beds on journeys, pilgrims grouping by gender in church dormitories, guards or servants sleeping at the feet of their lords, strangers bundled under the same blanket, exchanging only names before sleep. Rules of the bed included sleeping head to foot, especially among strangers, keeping one's hands to oneself, a common admonition in humorous literature, not turning too frequently or disturbing others, maintaining silence unless conversation was mutually welcome. To violate these codes by taking more space, speaking too loudly, or worse, risked scorn or even being expelled from the lodging altogether. The problem of privacy. Privacy as we know it was nearly non-existent. Most people lived communally, in shared homes, workshops, or farms. Sleep was just one more shared task. Curtains, when present, were symbolic. In wealthier homes, bed curtains denoted status, not solitude. In inns, the only separation might be a thin partition, a hanging cloth, or nothing at all. Yet people developed rituals of modesty, even without space. Turning away to change clothing. Sleeping in undergarments or cloaks, depending on context. Speaking in low tones, avoiding personal topics at night. Avoiding eye contact during early mornings, when everyone was disheveled and bleary-eyed. These behaviors created a kind of social privacy, not through physical separation, but through mutual discretion. Risks of the night. Despite these codes, danger lurked in shared sleep. Common concerns included theft, pouches, boots, or tools might vanish before dawn. Unwanted advances, particularly for women, even in all-female spaces. Lice or fleas, often shared along with the blanket. Drunken quarrels, a night's rest could end with fists or worse. Travelers often adopted precautions. Sleeping with possessions as pillows. Tying money bags to belts under clothing. Keeping knives or cudgels near at hand. Choosing bedmates carefully, if choice was available. It was not uncommon for someone to refuse a bed in favor of a spot by the fire, where light and proximity to others offered some measure of safety. Gender and the sleeping floor. Gender shaped sleep, but not always in ways we might expect. In monasteries or pilgrim hostels, strict separation was observed. In inns, practicality often overruled policy. When possible, women slept together or with children. Men formed separate groups, sometimes based on occupation or region. Married couples, when present, were usually given a single bed. But in overcrowded spaces, these lines blurred. Alehouses sometimes had only one room, and sleep arrangements became improvisational. This led to discomfort and sometimes to scandal. Satirical poems and morality plays frequently mocked the chaotic, mixed-gender sleeping of common inns, portraying it as both risque and ridiculous. But for most medieval people, necessity dulled propriety. A warm place to lie was more urgent than social scruples. Sleeping on the floor in the loft, or not at all. Even shared beds were a luxury for many. Attics and haylofts served as overflow space. Benches and hearths hosted the last arrivals. Outbuildings or sheds might be opened for latecomers. In desperate cases, people simply sat upright all night, cloaked against the cold. Better to sleep like a sack of flour than freeze like a knight, one proverb quipped. And some travelers simply didn't sleep, choosing to press on, wait for dawn, or rest in shifts. The ethics of the bed, generosity and obligation. Beyond coin, there existed a deep-rooted sense of hospitality obligation, particularly in rural areas. To offer someone lodging, or at least a place to lie, was a Christian duty, linked to the biblical command to shelter strangers. A marker of honor, especially among hosts or innkeepers. A social expectation, with failure remembered and retold. Likewise, to share your bed with a fellow traveler, literally or figuratively, was a sign of solidarity. Poets and chroniclers often praised such acts, viewing them as proof that even in a harsh world, kindness endured through hospitality. Dreams in the dark. And so, under rafters of oak and thatch, amid the sounds of breathing, snoring, and the restless shifting of straw, medieval men and women slept. Perhaps fitfully, perhaps uncomfortably, but they slept together. They dreamed of home, or of the next road, or perhaps of nothing at all. And in the shared stillness of the night, they participated in one of the oldest human traditions. Making do with what is given, and finding rest in the company of strangers. An open thought in the flicker of embers. In a world where sleep is shared, and space must be negotiated, what does it mean to trust someone with your dreams? And if a night's rest relies not on locks, but on mutual respect, what happens when that trust breaks? The candle gutters. Somewhere outside, a rooster stirs too early. Inside, a guest wakes with stiff limbs and the smell of damp straw in their cloak. The innkeeper yawns, shaking the cinders into flame. It is morning and sleep is over. But long before the weary traveler steps onto the road again, the echoes of the night remain. This final section explores how medieval lodging practices left lasting cultural, economic, and social impressions, and how the humble act of finding a place to rest shaped trade, law, infrastructure, and identity across Europe. As we close this chapter, we examine what sleep meant in a world where space was scarce, privacy was unknown, and hospitality was a fragile thread that bound communities together. The economic function of sleep. Lodging was more than a comfort, it was a commercial pillar of medieval life. Towns that served as market hubs, pilgrimage stops, or crossroads relied on inns, hostels, and alehouses to serve the constant churn of people on the move. Merchants needed places to sleep safely with their goods. Messengers and couriers required fast turnover and secure lodging. Pilgrims sought rest and spiritual comfort. Laborers and journeymen often moved seasonally and needed affordable nightly lodging. This demand created